Good afternoon. You're here on Likeable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. Joining me by Skype today is Dr. Ken Paller. Welcome, Ken.
Welcome. Thank you very much. I wish I was there with you in Hawaii.
Ken is joining us via Skype from Evanston, Illinois. He is a professor at Northwestern University there. He's the director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Program also. Ken did his undergraduate work at UCLA, took a doctorate in neuroscience at UC San Diego, has done postdoctoral fellowships at Yale, University of Manchester, and Berkeley. He's a fellow of the Mind and Life Institute, a journal editor at Neuropsychologia, and a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. He's won the Senator Mark Hatfield Award from the Alzheimer's Association, and he gets, he's gotten research funding from National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, and other various private and governmental groups. We're going to talk about learning during waking and sleep with Ken here. But before we do, I want to jump in and do one of my little campfire stories. And this, unlike a number of those, this one is one I just recently ran into, and it intrigued me. Well, I hope you'll see why it intrigued me, but it also fits very well with our theme today, this learning during waking and sleep. It's based on a column that I read from Discover Magazine on their Inkfish blog called "Blood-Sucking Bugs Are Smart by Night, Dumb by Day." And two researchers in France, Vinogre and Lazari of Universidad François Rabelais, decided to look at how these kissing bugs learn, and if their learning is affected by the time of day at which they learn. And the kissing bugs have a nice, reliable reflex. They stick out their proboscis to suck blood when a warm object approaches them, basically somebody's face. So what these researchers did, they taught the bugs to suppress this, because anytime the bug reached out and touched this warm little heating element, they would then turn it way up very high and make it heat extremely hot. And so the bug would withdraw its proboscis. And the bugs will learn after a certain number of trials not to approach it. But what was intriguing in their research was that these bugs, if they learn this at night, they're absolutely fine. They'll remember it 24 hours later. They'll remember it 36 hours later, that is in the middle of the day. They'll remember it at night. They've learned it very well. If you teach them this task during their daytime, even if it's dark, but if it's their circadian day, they will not learn it at all. I mean, they'll learn it, but they won't remember it. That is, you test them 12 hours later or 24 hours later, and they're just like they've never run into this task before. So it's a very intriguing sort of parallel situation here, showing that learning can be influenced by the time of day at which, and sort of one's sleep-wake cycle. And that's the kind of thing that Ken and I are going to talk about here. So Ken, maybe you can start by telling us how you got interested in this whole business of memory and learning, and how you got your start in this field of research.
Well, I've been interested in memory as it's studied in quite a few ways, and one of the ways that's quite interesting is studies of patients with amnesia. So studies of amnesia have shown us that there are really different types of memory. They're organized differently in the brain. They sometimes work independently, sometimes together, and that has really shed a lot of light on how we think about memory and how it works in the brain. In addition, we understand that the type of memory that most amnesic patients have real trouble with, we call that declarative memory. It includes memory for facts and episodes. And to remember a fact, you have to have three parts. You have to acquire the information, you have to store it and consolidate it well, and you have to retrieve it later. And so this consolidation phase in the middle is quite interesting, because it means that memories don't just instantly stick in your brain when you put some information in the computer and it's just there, but actually it takes some time to be integrated and to actually become stable. And that makes memory an interesting process that is taking time to actually happen.
I see. So, and this is why sometimes you may not remember certain events if they've sort of been overridden by a stronger event right afterwards. They didn't have time to consolidate, as it were, in your brain.
Yeah, in fact, the most extreme case would be in retrograde amnesia. So if you have some brain insult, you might lose the ability to acquire new memories. That's what we call anterograde amnesia.
Right.
But you might also lose some memories you had previous to the insults, maybe in minutes, maybe hours, maybe even days. And that retrograde amnesia that goes back suggests that those memories weren't quite fixed in your brain well enough to stay, and the insult disrupted that consolidation process. So we call consolidation this process of stabilizing memories and integrating them and mixing them in with the information you've stored previously.
Right, and that was their famous patient HM, I think he went always by his initials, who had I think some sort of hippocampal lesion done early on and became an anterograde amnesiac. He could not basically learn anything new, although he had perfectly good older memory.
Quite right. So he was one example that told us quite a lot about how memory works, and he had perhaps both the anterograde amnesia and some retrograde amnesia. So it helped us learn about how consolidation works, and also the fact that he could acquire some memories like motor skills quite normally. So it means that this memory insult didn't disrupt every type of memory. Some types of memory were still working just fine, could be acquired normally. You could maybe do some conditioning like the insects can do, but he couldn't actually remember the events that were surrounding that conditioning or any other events.
So this is like sort of the apocryphal case of a physician who can get anterograde amnesia, but still can tie perfect surgical knots, even though I may not know anything about that, but he can do it perfectly well.
That's right. So he might not lose his skills that he acquired many years earlier.
Right.
He might be able to gain new skills, but the retrograde amnesia is maybe a certain period of time. So we don't expect amnesic patients like HM or other patients to forget their old childhood or their young adulthood. Their old remote memories seem to be stabilized already, so often those are not lost.
Right.
More often we have a limited retrograde amnesia.
Right.
Recent times, right before the insult.
Right. And we indeed even see a somewhat similar phenomena in older patients as they begin to drift into dementia, right? Oftentimes they seem to lose the ability to consolidate new memories, although you can talk to them about their childhood and they'll remember vivid details from their childhood. It can discuss the people, the places they knew as a child, but they can't tell you whether it's Monday or Tuesday. They can't tell you when they last saw you. They can't tell you who the president is.
Yeah, and these very old memories, they're not necessarily stored in a different part of the brain, but they've maybe been rehearsed so many times because they're decades old. And so these memories become more stable because of all that additional practice. So in fact, that's the principle of making a solid memory is, of course, you have to practice. And what you rehearse over and over again is what you can remember well. So the oldest memories are in fact the most stable people. And so they're the last ones that a patient with Alzheimer's disease would lose usually.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's intriguing, and that fits in, of course, with almost any other aspects of human behavior or performance, right? Is that practice and repetitive practice and doing it again and again and again in many different situations will make you better and better and better at that particular task. And so, not surprising, memory might behave in a similar way, right?
Quite right. If you meet a new person and you learn their name, it's good to rehearse it a bit, not just expect you're going to know it next time, but you have to use it and rehearse it, and that's what's going to make you better able to retrieve their name later.
Right, and we all see this learning new computer software these days, right? If you learn a new piece of software and you don't sit down right away and use it a few times, the odds are when you next try to do it a few weeks later, you won't really have much clue about how to do it anymore, right?
So the other side note about practice then is that we think you can intentionally practice information you acquire, but in addition, during sleep, one of the benefits of sleep is perhaps rehearsal of information you've recently acquired, and again, that integration into brain networks that are producing a solid memory. So practicing memories perhaps is one of the things we don't realize we do every night while we're asleep.
Yes, this is gets into the wonderful article that I ran into that first put me on to Dr. Paller's work, was this intriguing study about unlearning very deep social biases during sleep, and his group set up an experiment, and later on in the show we'll talk a bit about this work. It's so utterly fascinating and amazing to me that you can do that kind of very serious learning, as it were, during sleep, and it's something you almost can't accomplish as well when you're awake, right?
perhaps there's some things that are better practiced during sleep than wake. We're still working on trying to understand that.
Many college students will love that, right?
Well, we're actually talking not about a shortcut. There's no way around doing the work of the learning in the first place. But what I said is it doesn't stop there. You have to continue to rehearse. And so the rehearsal during sleep is part of the additional work that has to be done. It's perhaps something we do anyway, because we wake up in the morning, we don't realize what our brain has been busy doing all night. The brain isn't off the way your laptop when you shut the top of your laptop and it's asleep. Nothing's happening.
Right.
Our human sleep is much different than that, and our brain is very busy, and some of that rehearsal is happening, and perhaps we can do better with that. So if your sleep isn't functioning optimally, you're not sleeping enough, or you're not sleeping in the right kind of way, that can have detrimental effects on your ability to remember.
So there's very serious sort of clinical application to this work then too.
Yes, that's something we're looking into. Part of the way of thinking about it is what we call age-related memory decline. So it's quite normal to start experiencing poor memory in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and that memory decline isn't quite understood yet. And we're wondering whether there's some contribution of memory processing during sleep. As it's well known that sleep quality also declines during those days.
I was going to say, yeah, that is intriguing, because certainly that's a very common experience that during sort of middle age you begin not to sleep as well as maybe you used to, and so, it'll be interesting to see how that comes out. You use the term conscious and the non-conscious memory expressions, and I think we all probably know what conscious memory is, but can you talk a little bit about sort of what you mean by non-conscious memory expression?
Sure, there's several categories of non-conscious memory. Sometimes we use the term non-declarative memory to distinguish it between the type of memory I mentioned earlier, episodes and facts. So besides episodes and facts, we can also learn motor skills, or maybe more cognitive skills. How to use a computer program, say, might be a skill, and you don't have to remember the initial time where you learned that information. That episode isn't so important. What you need to be able to do is engage in that action next time you need to perform that skill. And so we're not conscious of the learning in that sense. We just know how to produce that motor skill. And so motor skills are one type. Some types of conditioning are another, where you associate different stimuli together with each other. You don't need to necessarily be conscious of having acquired that conditioned knowledge. And another type we refer to as priming, where certain perceptual or conceptual information might be more fluent because you've experienced it recently. So if I see a face, if I see that same face the next day, my brain might be more efficient at processing that face and figuring out who it is. And that efficiency isn't the same as being able to say, oh, I remember you, Ethan, I met you earlier. But it might still make you process that face more quickly and behave differently. And so this unconscious information becomes quite interesting. It might even inform you about whether you're in some familiar environment, or even whether there's some danger in the environment. You can perceive that information in this unconscious way, and that can influence your behavior and your decisions. So sometimes this unconscious information can be very useful. We think of it sometimes as in the category of decision-making that's intuitive. So if you make an intuitive decision, it might be quite the correct decision to make because you're using information you've acquired even without consciously knowing you've acquired that information. You might recognize someone as being dangerous, or a friend that you want to see again. And so you can use that information in this unconscious way and guide your behavior accordingly. So it's quite useful.
And this kind of non-conscious memory is consolidated and thus sort of, you're saying, strengthened during sleep processes. And indeed, if sleep is badly enough disrupted, that's not going to happen then. Is that sort of the implication?
Yeah, that's true. We think it depends on sleep in a similar way, but it also, these types of memory also have some interesting differences. So if we think of episodes and facts, that's the type of memory that someone with amnesia or early Alzheimer's disease might have great difficulty with. But they still might have good skills, good unconscious memories. They might even have good habits. So their habits might guide them through the day in a quite useful way because they've got these solid habits that are not depending on the same brain systems that are disruptive, that are important for facts and episodes.
Excellent. Well, this is great to talk about this. Fascinating to hear about it. I want to move on when we come back after a short break. I want to move on and talk about that article that I referenced at the start and get you to explain a little more about that. So we'll do that when we come back from a short break here. You're on Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. With me today is Dr. Ken Paller from Northwestern University.
Aloha, my name is PJ and I'm the host of Hawaii Sports Update. I am very interested in local sports and that's why I host the Hawaii Sports Update show. I bring in guests from Hawaii, I bring in guests from UH, I bring in guests from the community, I bring in big names, I bring in small names, I bring in all names that are community related and doing positive things, sports related in the community. Come join me every Tuesday at 1 p.m. here on Hawaii Sports Update. You can also join me on my golf tournament, the first annual PJ Sports Radio Show golf tournament. It's going to be held at Coral Creek. For any information, go to ThinkTech Hawaii, INC, and friend us. The PayPal and a summary of the event will be right there available for you. And don't forget to tweet us.
And you're back here on Likeable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. Joining me today in the ThinkTech studios by Skype is Dr. Ken Paller from Northwestern University, a psychologist who studies memory. And we were talking in the first part of the show about the importance of sleep for consolidation of memory and how sleep helps us critically tie our memories in, make them accessible, make them hold them in our minds, as it were, and make us enable us to access them. Dr. Paller studied, or recently wrote an article with several colleagues on an intriguing study where people's social biases were impacted. And we want to get in and talk about that. Perhaps we can start by getting an overview of your research. I believe we have a short video here that will explain a little bit, sort of give our viewers some context of what your lab really does.
Memory and sleep, and how it might be possible to boost how much you remember while you snooze.
We think perhaps many stages of sleep are important for memory. However, a lot of the evidence has shown that slow wave is particularly important for some types of memory.
Slow wave sleep is the deepest kind we get.
All right, Susan, come on in. And what you're going to do is try to respond to these moving circles on the screen.
Lab group members demonstrated for us two of the tests that they run on study participants. In one test, Susan learns to play two tunes. Blue circles are one tune, red ones another. Then sensors monitor her brain waves while she naps. One of the tunes she learned plays softly to her as she sleeps. In a second exercise, Ileana memorizes the location of objects as they appear on a screen. Each object has a signature sound. Again, her brain waves are monitored as 25 of those 50 sounds play back to her while she naps. In both experiments, participants who were able to nod off did a better job remembering what was reinforced while they slept.
We think that memory processing happens during sleep every night. So we're at the beginning stages of finding out what types of memory can be improved and how large the improvements can be and what sorts of stimuli work.
Paller's goal is to better understand the fundamental brain mechanisms responsible for memory, and that in turn may help people with memory problems, including...
All right, that gives a nice overview, as I say, about the kinds of research you do. And in this particular article, you spoke of some research about people's, what did you call it, implicit social biases, I believe. And you did this so-called counter stereotype training. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and sort of what it involves and how you go about that?
Yeah, perhaps it's good to again, categorize these different types of memory. So in the video clip, there was a motor skill that was Guitar Hero and playing a melody on a keyboard. There was spatial memory, which is an example of declarative memory, episodes and facts. And I also talked about priming earlier as a type of memory that can help our intuitive decision making. So that's an example of a type of unconscious memory that helps us make better decisions. Now, implicit social biases is another type of unconscious guidance to our memory, not necessarily always helping us. So the social biases might be that you have ideas about the capability of women, and you think women aren't good scientists, but men are. So that would be a bias against women and science. You might also have a bias against people as a function of their skin color. So we studied these biases, which can be measured in particular ways that have been used by social psychologists to try to find out what kind of biases might be present, even though we might not admit to them. So you might say, well, no, I think women are perfectly good scientists compared to men, but you might still have a bias in there that isn't maybe something you're even aware of because you picked it up from media, from your culture. And that might still influence your behavior when you're interacting with other people. And the same for the different racial biases.
Right.
So
how do you reveal these then?
Sorry?
So how do you reveal these biases if people aren't aware of them?
That's right. So the method that's been used to reveal them is called the implicit association test, and it has you press buttons really quickly to faces and also to words. And the faces might be women and men, the words might be science words and non-science words, but you have two buttons, and if the same button is used for men and science, you might be faster to press the buttons. But if in another situation, if the same button is used for women and science, you might then be slower because that association is not right with you. So that's a sneaky way of measuring it. So instead of asking you, how do you feel about women in science, you have to press these buttons quickly, and it reveals this association between men versus women in science that you can pick it up. Same with African American and positive and negative attributes. So these tests are widely used and show that everybody pretty much has some biases that, again, might be present in their unconscious and may or may not influence their behavior. There are a number of studies suggesting that the degree to which you have a bias does, in fact, in general, correlate with your behavior, demonstrating that bias. For example, if you have to decide in a video game whether to shoot a person that looks like they're carrying a gun, perhaps, the results depend on whether it's an African American or a Caucasian face, and that correlates with your bias towards these two different racial groups. So we studied this type of learning to change the bias. And so the way of changing the bias is a type of learning that's called counter-stereotype training.
Right.
And it's analogous to meeting a bunch of people that exemplify the opposite of the bias. Like in my example, meeting a lot of wonderful women scientists that are great at doing what they do. And so that can counteract the bias that women aren't good at science. Likewise with the African American bias. So we do this counter-stereotype training not by having people actually meet people, because that takes too much time, but there's a shortcut, which is making associations between, in this case, women and science words. So they make this association, and we can see that decreases the bias. Likewise, we can decrease the African American negative bias. And so we wanted to see, well, is that type of learning, like all the other types of learning we studied, spatial memory, motor skill memory, is it like that type, the other types of memory, in that it depends on sleep? Can we actually speed up the learning of reducing racial bias or gender bias during sleep? And that's what we found in our study, that using the very same methods where people do some learning, there's some sounds that go along with it. We use those sounds to remind them of the learning they did while they're asleep without them realizing it. They have a little nap, the sounds are played softly, it doesn't wake them up, but it reactivates their brain networks that store the information they just acquired and makes that information stick longer. And so we're able to keep that bias reduction present longer by presenting those cues during sleep and showing, therefore, the conclusion is that memory processing during sleep has something to do with the learning that underlies reducing your social bias.
So that's, it sounds like a potentially very powerful technique in some sense to help level the playing field almost, right?
That's right. The counter-bias training has been studied for many years, but the problem is those effects go away very quickly because you're quickly back in your own culture, your own TV shows. The bias you've gotten, you didn't get it overnight, you got it over years and years of being exposed to the media. So you can't change a habit. A bad habit doesn't change immediately. You have to work at it. And so the work might be continuing the training and continuing to meet people that exemplify the opposite of the standard stereotypes. And reinforcing that during your sleep is part of what will make that training stick.
Yeah, I see it. So that's quite a phenomenon here. And sort of how large an effect is this? I mean, is this a dramatic reversal? Are people surprised when they get the results of their tests?
Well, we only measured this artificial way of establishing the bias, so we don't know, did people behave differently to the people of the gender or the racial category. We didn't measure social interactions, which can be done too, but we measured it in this other way. And our question was really, is there any effect of sleep? Okay. So we were asking, does sleep have something to do with it? And we were interested to learn that it does. Whether the effects are large is an interesting question because they only had 15 minutes of training before people went to sleep, and they only had a few minutes of reinforcement during sleep. So no, the effects weren't large, but perhaps large regimens of training and more memory processing during sleep could make larger effects. That remains to be done. So, this is an initial study.
Right.
It's hopefully going to interest other scientists and drive more research to understand more about what's going on. So at our starting point, we've said sleep has something to do with learning in this category of social bias learning, just like it does for skill learning and fact learning.
Right, and even with that relatively brief, you said it was 15 minutes of counter-stereotype training and only a 15-minute nap. But as I recall in that article, even a week later when retested, that you were seeing impacts still from that.
That's right. It was an hour and a half nap with
okay.
some stimulation during the slow wave sleep period, because slow wave sleep turns out to be, as we mentioned in the video, an ideal time for this type of memory processing. And when they woke up, we saw the effects were present. When people came back a week later, there was, again, a hint of the effects. It had gotten smaller. So as expected, the effects decline after a week, but something still seemed to be showing up, suggesting that there's an opportunity to make the training more effective. Certainly, more than 15 minutes of training might be a good thing to do as well, as reinforcing.
Right. No, that's very impressive results from a very brief training session, and then, as you say, a single, even if it's 90 minutes of sleep, a single episode of sleep, basically. I gather during that single episode of sleep that you play that tone at certain points when you believe they would be sort of primed to be working on that memory, be consolidating it, and that might be hundreds of times during that 90 minutes.
That's right. So we're trying to understand what's happening in the brain during sleep, and it's well known that there are different stages of sleep called stage 1, stage 2, and so forth. And one of the stages, slow wave sleep, has these dramatic slow oscillations of brain activity about every second. And those oscillations seem to be not a sign of the brain being off, but rather there's an alternating lots of neural activity and very little neural activity during each cycle of a slow wave. And so slow wave, when there's the slow wave period when there's lots of activity, seems to be a prime chance for different parts of the brain to coordinate and communicate with each other. And that seems to be the opportune time for memory processing and more plasticity. Plasticity is this word for how the neurons in the brain can change their connectivity, and that's in fact the basis of the learning that we're studying.
Right, so there's probably some very real physiological change going on, and new synapses being formed, or synapses being pruned back, or synapses being strengthened in some sense, right? I mean,
yes, there's a lot more to learn about how that works, but we have a starting point to try to investigate that, and then to try to make it work better. So one other way we're interested in trying to make this process work better is to enhance slow wave activity. So people can sleep with some method. We've used an electrical method. There's also some auditory methods we're using that can make slow waves larger, perhaps keep the brain in the right state to generate these slow waves and to do the memory processing. It's helpful. That's a very interesting prospect for improving sleep quality, which might have many benefits for people.
Very, very intriguing, very intriguing. That's, sounds like it could help a lot of people. And is this, I know you didn't do a whole lot of subjects there, but you found it pretty much in all your subjects?
Well, we generally look at groups of people, so we're not to the point of a clinical treatment to say what are the chances of it working. But this is the work I was just talking about is with my colleague Phyllis C., who's a professor in the neurology department, and she studies sleep disorders and has an idea of how we might use methods to treat with sleep disorders, as well as people who are just not having the high sleep quality they'd like to get. So we're interested in looking at that and eventually trying to see how widely it might be helpful for people.
Yeah.
Right? It's in the early stages of trying to develop the methods and understand how to optimize the methods.
Right, right. It seems like there's certainly a lot of different parameters to adjust on this, and a lot of different aspects you might want to look at manipulating to see how to, as you say, how to optimize it. So,
yeah, and then to figure out what are the benefits exactly and how large are they.
Right. So that's great. We're going to look at sort of the future of this work when we come back. We're going to talk a little bit about where this might lead and discuss sort of a bit more of the context. And I might get a little provocative with you there in the next segment. I hope not too badly. But before that, we're going to take a brief break here. Ken Paller and I are talking about memory during sleep and waking. You're here on Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen, and we'll be back after a short break.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard. I'm the host of Center Stage here on ThinkTech Hawaii. Center Stage airs every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, and of course you can check out our archives on YouTube or on ThinkTech Hawaii anytime you like. Why should you do that? Because this is an arts show that I believe is making a difference in lives. We talk with artists of various ilk. We talk with painters and writers, playwrights, novelists, poets, sculptors, dancers, you name it, directors, actors, of course. And we don't only talk about what people do, but we talk about how they do it. And my favorite part of the conversation, we talk about why they do it. And it's really common on this show to hear people say, wow, I didn't think about it that way. And it's very common to hear people afterwards who have seen the show say the same thing. And I hear all the time that people are inspired by the conversations that we have. So why don't you join us and be inspired too? That's Center Stage on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock. We'll see you Center Stage.
And you're back here on Likeable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Ethan Allen, here doing our Friday afternoon Likeable Science show, as we do each week. With me today, joining me by Skype from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, is Dr. Ken Paller, a psychologist there, a director of Cognitive Neuroscience Program. We're talking about memory during sleep and waking. And in the last segment, we were talking about this intriguing study where subjects were exposed to counter-stereotype training, that is, training to help them sort of work against their implicit and often unconscious social biases, and then watching the impact of sleeping on that and seeing that sleeping actually improved the learning, helped them retain that, the impact of that training for longer periods and at higher levels. And very preliminary work, but very exciting, certainly. Thank you for sharing that with us, Ken. So do you see ethical issues involved in this work? I mean, people will look at this right away and sort of immediately sort of, take it and run and assume there's going to be all kinds of interesting issues and abilities to control people's thoughts, likes, dislikes, et cetera.
I think it's important to keep in mind that the procedures aren't entirely sleep-based. Mm-hmm. That, in fact, nothing's working until first there's training while people are awake. So people learn some task, it could be guitar hero, it could be some other task, but the learning happens while the individuals are awake, and then we reinforce what they learned during sleep.
Right.
So the learning itself is not happening without people's permission, without their willingness.
Right. They have to collaborate and actively try to pick up the new task or whatever.
That's right. And they can be resistant to it, and then they're not going to learn, and then we're not going to be able to reinforce anything during their sleep because they didn't learn to begin with.
Uh-huh.
So it's not a backdoor into their brain to change things.
Okay, so you don't sort of see sort of that it's a tool for brainwashing or anything on that nature then.
Well, we should think about that a bit. I sometimes wonder if an evil hotel chain could start sensing with their beds whether you're asleep or not, and then playing messages that would make you like their hotel chain or dislike another hotel chain. We wouldn't find that pleasant, and if word got out, no one would want to go to that hotel chain anymore. So, maybe we need legislation against that, or maybe that's just not going to work anyway. But yeah, we're trying to reinforce learning that happens during waking, and so the learning has to happen first for there to be a valuable consequence of sleep processing.
Absolutely. We have, by the by, and I didn't mention this at the start, Ken, but we have people who watch this and tweet in questions here, and we have a comment or a question here from a Mark Ward, who asks about what causes the reorganization of memory. He says his dad has vascular dementia, thinks his mom died years ago, and women in his house, and the woman in his house is an imposter. So he's I guess asking about sort of in some sense a false memory, I guess.
Yeah, there are some syndromes that happen with certain types of brain damage, and I'm not sure I followed exactly the question, but there's a certain syndrome called Capgras syndrome, where faces of the people you know remain familiar. So it's actually a face processing trouble people have, but with face blindness, you don't recognize the people you know anymore. Mm-hmm. Capgras syndrome, you recognize them, but you think they're imposters. So somehow they've lost their emotional connection, and that's a quite interesting sort of processing of the affective aspects of things that seem to be disconnected from standard processing.
Yeah, that sounds like what he was asking about, and so that's very interesting. Actually, you get into an area that little off our topic, but I'd really love to get your input on it. You mentioned face blindness, and is that a skill which basically probably exists on a continuum, where there are people who have very good memories for faces and are very able to recognize faces and sort of connect them to people, versus other people who essentially, won't recognize their parents or their kids or whatever?
Yeah, there's some neat studies that I've read about that. So there's two ways of thinking about face blindness. One is you can acquire deficit in perceiving faces by damage to your visual system in your brain, your visual cortex, that makes it difficult to perceive faces anymore or to recognize the people you know. But without brain damage, of course, there's just variability in the population. And some people are super recognizers, and they can remember people they've seen once or figure out who they've seen even after many years, and their faces change entirely and they can still recognize the face. And then there are people at the other extreme that have difficulty figuring out who they're looking at, and they might be better with a voice, and they hear the voice and they know who they're talking to, but just with the face, they can't recognize the person. And that's sort of an extreme case, and some people are better at recognizing faces than others. So we have all variety. So face blindness would be the extreme. And Chuck Close, the famous artist who paints a lot of portraits, in fact, has this syndrome of face blindness and doesn't perceive faces very well at all, but paints them.
Huh, that's intriguing. It's like therapy almost. And it's odd. Apparently that recognition is not unique to people. That is, there are wonderful and very moving examples among animals of animals recognizing one another even after separations of many years. Elephants being sort of the classic example. Elephants who knew each other well, but then were separated for periods literally of decades, have been reunited, and it's awesome to see them interact with each other, and it's very clear they know who the other one is right away, and recognize them and wish to be with them. So it's not a uniquely human ability, I guess.
Yes, and it's quite an amazing skill. So we work at it over our whole lives, so that we can recognize all the people we want to recognize. And So it's a case of expertise, and we think it's dependent on the cortex being plastic and developing these networks that allow us to have this expertise to perceive faces with such fine fidelity.
Yeah. So does this then, is this the same kind of thing, or are you, you had used in your article, I think, the term shortcuts, talking about sort of our mental biases sometimes are ways that our mind cuts to the chase and gets us the key information quickly.
Yeah, well, that was, the shortcut is with respect to, say, race or gender. So if you see a person, you don't know who they are yet, but you might use their external features to make some assumptions about what they're like and whether they can be trusted, or any number of other questions without just getting to know them. And so sometimes we have to make those shortcuts. And those are the social biases that we want to be wary of. So we want to think, well, is this a good shortcut to be using? Is it helpful? Is it detrimental? And then we have a choice of trying to avoid those shortcuts. Let's say you're a manager in a business and you have to make hiring decisions. Well, you want to hire the best people. And the superficial features might not really be getting you the information about who's going to be the best individual. So you'd want to try to avoid your implicit social biases. And so you can try to counteract them. And in our study, we looked at trying to actually reduce them before they're operative.
Yeah, that's very, very powerful. Could this be, could your kind of work ever be, could you see it ever being sort of, in some sense, mandated for people to go through as a sort of, I don't want to say exactly a punishment, but as a directive to help them behave in more acceptable ways? Or do you think, again, because the initial learning has to be sort of participated in a voluntary fashion, this couldn't really ever be used in that sense?
Well, I think that's an important issue. There are a couple of roadblocks that make it a little difficult, but I think if you're in a position of authority, if you're a judge, a police officer, maybe, or a person making hiring decisions, it might be important to consider what kind of social biases you have and how they're influencing you. And perhaps some training would be helpful. I think judges want to make the right decision, and there are programs, I've heard about some in California, that new judges can go through workshops and try to understand what kind of implicit social biases they might have without realizing it, and how they can counteract the effects of those. So certainly training would be helpful. One of the difficulties is to actually measure how much of a social bias each person has. So in our lab, we use that test I mentioned, the implicit association test, but it might not have the power to actually say how much exact bias each person has at any moment. So actually measuring it to be sure you do or don't have a bias, it's a little bit difficult right at the moment. But nevertheless, I still think it's worth thinking about these questions. And if we want more fairness in our society, we should think about, well, how can we get there? What can we do to try to improve the situation?
Right, because it is all too easy for virtually any of us to make very quick judgments on people based on very superficial characteristics. You see some, say, a young man with a baseball cap on backwards and carrying a skateboard, and you're probably not going to think this guy might be a very sensitive, talented poet. You're going to have probably other thoughts about him before that, right, and make other assumptions. And so it is a very, it's something we all do quite pervasively, I suspect.
Yeah, so if we think about the U.S. incarceration rates for different racial groups, we would want to try to figure out what some of that's due to biases that people hold.
Right, because certain groups, of course, are very disproportionately represented, and that may be indeed a real outcome of exactly this kind of work. So where do you see this, very quickly, where do you see this, what do we need to do in the future? Is it just really a matter of sort of digging into this work, into this area a little deeper and doing some more research?
Well, we still have a lot more to learn about how memory works and to understand the contribution that memory processing during sleep makes to it. And I think we have certainly a lot of different types of memory to look at. So I've been emphasizing how we try to study these different types of memory, and they come to play in a lot of circumstances. So just in the field of education, we want to understand how we can do education better, we would want to try to take these ideas into account about how memory works and brain function that's relevant for that. Maybe in clinical environments, if you're trying to treat depression, treating people with some therapies where they're learning some new habits about how to behave, maybe we can add thinking about sleep to that. So, sleep is often neglected as not part of what's important for waking behavior, but it really is a critical key for the learning that we do. And therefore, it might have a role in all types of training or learning situations.
Exactly, and you've made a compelling argument for it, and it fits in well with my the little story that I told at the start of the show, that yes, sleep and waking are go hand in hand, and can that part of your cycle can really profoundly influence what kind of learning you do. Anyhow, I'd like to say thank you so much for being with me today, and thank you, Ken, and I wish you much luck in your future research.
Thanks very much, Ethan. It's been fun to talk to you.
All right, and to our viewers out there, hope you'll join us again next week. Aloha.